by, documented every date, time, outcome. Then I woke up and the record changed. That's what Dr. Marcus Webb would tell himself later, when he tried to reconstruct the exact moment everything started. But even that memory, that certain, would eventually become sus. The question wasn't just what had changed. It was whether he could trust his own mind to remember what had been. It started on a Tuesday morning in March, in the windowless sublevel of a Portland research facility that officially didn't. Marcus had spent the previous night documenting Anomaly 7, a phenomenon that manifested as localized temporal distortions in the observation. He'd recorded 17 distinct occurrences between 11:47 p.m. and 4:20 a.m., each one meticulously time-stamped, described, and cross-referenced with sensor data. His notes were perfect. They always were. That's what made him valuable to the archive, this classified repository of inexplicable events that the government preferred to study rather than acknowledge. Marcus prided himself on precision. His background in forensic data analysis had taught him that details mattered, that truth lived in the specificity of recorded observation. Every entry in his log followed the same rigorous format: times, environmental condition, duration, visual character, sensor, and his own phenomenological observation. He developed this system over 3 years of working the arc, and it had never failed. His reports were cited as model of scientific documentation. Director Holloway had personally commended his attention to detail during his last. So when Marcus opened his workstation that Tuesday morning, coffee steaming beside his, and pulled up yesterday's observation, the discrepancy hit him like a physical. Entry 7, recorded at 1:34 a.m., was wrong, not missing, not corrupted, wrong. The time stamp now read 1:36 a.m., 2 minutes later than he remembered typing. But it wasn't just the time. The description had changed too. Where he'd written distortion radius approximately 2.3, it now read distortion radius 2.3 for 7, expanding radially at 0.003. The level of precision was greater than his original, more specific, more accurate, if he was being honest. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the rest. Entry 11, originally logged 2:40, now showed 2:51. The description had been enhanced with technical details he didn't remember including. Entry 15 contained sensor correlation data he definitely hadn't added because the sensors had been malfunctioned during observation. Yet there it was, perfectly formatted, seamlessly integrated into his report, as if it had always been there. Marcus felt his chest tight. This wasn't. He worked alone during night shift. The facility's security was absolute. Every access point required biometric authentication. Even if someone had somehow breached his works, why would they improve his documentation? Why make it better? His mind raced through possibility, each more unsettling. Had he been so exhausted that he'd continued working without? Had his medication dosage been wrong, causing some kind of fugue state? He'd been managing his obsessive-compulsive disorder for years, but stress could trigger episodes. He opened his backup file. The archive's protocol required redundant documents. He maintained 3 separate backup systems, one of them completely offline on an encrypted external drive at his desk. Marcus pulled the drive out with shaking hand, connected, and waited for the file to load. His reflection stared back at him from the dark monitor during those endless seconds. Dark circles under 3-day stubble. The face of a man who'd chosen precision over sleep. The backup files loaded. Marcus opened the same document. His stomach dropped. The changes were there, identical. Every enhanced, every corrected times, every addition that he hadn't. All 3 backups matched perfect, but they matched the wrong, the version that shouldn't. He sat back in his chair, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and tried to understand what this meant. If the backups had been altered, someone had accessed, but when and how could they have changed offline storage without physically touching his drive, unless he'd done it himself? Unless he couldn't trust his own memory of what he'd written. Marcus stared at the screen, at the words that were his, but also, and felt the first crack in the foundation of everything he thought he knew about documentation, memory, and truth itself. Marcus didn't leave his workstation for 6 hours. He cross-referenced every file, every backup, every log entry he'd created in the past. The pattern emerged slowly, like a shape forming in. It wasn't just yesterday, Paul. Subtle changes appeared throughout his document, all following the same disturbing logic. Time stamps adjusted by measurements refined to additional decimal places. Observations enhanced with technical detail that made his original notes more accurate, more complete. Someone or something had been editing, improving. The realization should have been reassuring. Instead, it filled him with a dread he couldn't name. By early afternoon, Marcus had documented 17 instances of file modification across 3 weeks of report. The changes weren't random. They followed a pattern of increasing specificity, as if whatever was making them was learning his documentation, his scientific method, his way of perceiving and recording reality. But the modifications only appeared in files he'd worked on during night. Only he was alone. Only he pulled up the facility security, checking for any unauthorized access workstation or the server. Nothing. Every login was his own biometric signature. Every file accessed traced back to his credential. According to the official record, he was the only person to touch the office phone, shattering his concentration. Sarah Chen's voice came concerned and slightly irritated. She'd been trying to reach him for an hour. They had a scheduled meeting with Director Holloway to discuss the Anomaly 7 finding. Marcus had completely forgotten. He told her he'd be there in 5 minutes, his voice sounding hollow himself. As he gathered his note, a new thought occurred. One that made his hand freeze over the keyboard. What if the meeting had already happened? What if his memory of the schedule was wrong? He checked his calendar. The meeting was definitely now, 2 p.m., just as Sarah said. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that maybe it had always said, even if he remembered different. Director Holloway's office occupied the only corner of the archive with something resembling natural, though it was artificial, piped in through fiber optic cable from the surface 40 feet above. The director was a thin man, his 60s, with silver hair and the bureaucratic demeanor of someone who'd spent decades managing the inexplicable. By reducing, he gestured for Marcus and Sarah to sit, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp. Sarah took the chair beside Marcus, and he caught her glancing at him with barely concealed. He must look worse than he thought. Holloway opened the meeting by praising Marcus's recent documentation of Anomaly 7. The level of detail was exceptional, he said. Unprecedented. The kind of work that would set new standards for the archive's research protocol. Marcus felt his throat tighten. The director was praising the altered, the enhanced file. The ones Marcus hadn't entirely written. He tried to speak, to explain what he'd discovered, but the words tangled. How could he tell them his files had been edited when the security logs said? How could he claim his documentation had been improved without his knowledge, when that would make him sound paranoid, unstable, a liability? Sarah presented her own findings, her voice steady and professional. She'd been analyzing the sensor data from Anomaly 7, cross-referencing it with Marcus' observation. Everything correlated perfect, he said. His notes were incredibly more accurate than they had any right to be given the limitation of human perception during prolonged. She looked at Marcus when she said that, and something in her expression made him wonder if she knew. If she'd noticed something wrong too. but was choosing not to say it here, in front of Holloway, in the official record. Or maybe he was just reading meaning into nothing, seeing patterns that didn't exist because his mind was unraveling and he couldn't. Sarah caught up with Marcus in the hallway outside Holloway's office. Her hand on his arm was gentle and insistent, pulling him into an empty conference. She closed the door and studied his face with the kind of careful attention that made Marcus want to look up. They'd worked together for 2 years, long enough for her to read, to know when something was wrong beneath the surface carefully maintained. She asked him directly as happened. No preamble, no small talk, just the question hanging in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus told her everything. The altered time stamp, the enhanced description, the impossible accuracy of observations he knew he hadn't made precision. The identical changes across all his backups, including the offline drive that should have. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from concern to something harder when he finished. She was quiet for a long, her fingers drumming against the conference table in a rhythm that betrayed. Then she told him something that made his world tilt further. It had happened to her 3 months ago. Sarah, she'd noticed similar changes in her documentation of Anomaly, a phenomenon involving localized gravity fluctuation. Small refinement first, corrected decimal point, enhanced environmental. She'd assumed she was misremembering her own note, that exhaustion was playing tricks on her perception. But then the changes became more obvious. Entire paragraphs of technical analysis she had no memory of writing, yet they were brilliant, insightful, correct. She'd run the same test. Marcus checked the security log, found nothing. Every modification traced back to her own credential. During times she was definitely working. Marcus asked her why she hadn't reported, why she'd kept it secret. Sarah's laugh was bitter and short. She had reported it to Holloway, to the facility's psychological service. They'd adjusted her medical, suggested she was experiencing work-related stress, recommended she take time off. When she insisted something was genuinely wrong with the document system, they'd hinted that continued complaints might affect security, so she'd stopped complaining. She'd accepted the enhanced files as some quirk of her own memory, a cognitive glitch she'd learned to live with. But seeing Marcus discover the same thing, experiencing the same impossible alteration, changed everything. This wasn't individual delusion. This was systematic, real, undeniable. They sat in silence, processing what this meant. If their files were being altered, who else's were? Was everyone in the archive experienced, or just them? And more unsettling, why were the changes always proven? Why not corruption or delay? What kind of security breach made documentation better? Marcus pulled out his phone and opened his person, the one he used for non-classified observation. Even that had been touched. A note he'd written yesterday called his sister, included her, which he definitely hadn't typed because he'd memorized. The alteration was helpful, considerate, terrifying. Sarah saw his expression and asked what was. Marcus showed her the screen and watched her face go pale. Whatever was editing their files wasn't limited to the archive. It had access to everything. Marcus stopped sleeping. It was the only solution he'd think of. If the changes happened while he was unconscious, then staying awake would prevent them. Simple, logical, impossible to maintain. By the third night, his hands shook constant, and his vision blurred at the edges. Sarah brought him coffee and protein bar, urged him to reconsider, but he refused. He'd set up a camera system in his apartment, pointed directly at his laptop and his hand. If something was going to alter his documentation, he'd have video. He'd have evidence that couldn't be edited. couldn't be explained away as stress or memory failure or psychological instability. The first night of recording showed nothing unusual. Marcus reviewed the footage obsessively, watching himself work at his desk, head occasionally drooping before he jerked, determined to maintain his vigil. The second night was the same. Hours of grainy footage showing him alone, fighting sleep, checking and rechecking his file. But on the morning of the fourth day, when exhaustion reduced his thoughts to molasses and his body felt like it belonged to someone, Marcus made a discovery that shattered his understanding of what was possible. The camera footage was intact, unedited, continued. It showed him finally succumbing to sleep at 3:47 a.m., slumped over his desk, and at 4:12 a.m., while he remained motionless, his laptop screen, his document files open. Text began to change, one character at a time, words reforming themselves into more precise versions. The cursor never moved. No hands touched the keyboard. The edits simply manifested, as if the computer itself was considering, refining. Marcus watched the footage 5 times, then 10, then 20. Each viewing confirmed what his rational mind insisted couldn't. The laptop was editing his files autonomously, but computers, they executed code. They followed programmed structure. They didn't independently decide to improve documentation quality, unless something was running on his system he hadn't installed, or unless the anomaly he'd been documenting wasn't contained in the observation chamber at all. What if Anomaly 7 wasn't a localized phenomenon? What if it had been observing him the entire time he'd been observing, learning his pattern, understanding his method, and now, for reasons he couldn't begin to comprehend, it was helping him document itself more accurately? The thought filled Marcus with a terror so profound he couldn't name it. This wasn't a security. This wasn't a software. This was something aware, something intelligent, something that had decided his human perception needed. And if it could edit his files while he slept, what else could it edit? His memory, his thought, the fundamental architecture of his. Marcus showed Sarah the footage in the empty conference, the same one where she'd first confessed her own experience with the. She watched in silence, her face illuminated by the glow of his. And when the video ended, she asked to play it. Then, a third time. Her scientific training demanded repetition, verification, the elimination of alternate explanation. But there were no alternatives. The evidence was irrefutable. Something non-human was accessing their system and refining their document. Sarah leaned back in her chair and asked the question that had been haunting Marcus since he'd first reviewed. What did it? That's what terrified him most, Marcus admitted. The anomaly wasn't destroying evidence or hiding. It was making their work better, more accurate, more complete. Every edit improved the scientific quality of their observation. If this was an attack, it was the strangest one imagined. If it was help, the implications were even more. Sarah suggested they needed to run an experiment, something controlled and deliberate. They needed to create intentional errors in their documentation and see how the anomaly responded. Would it correct obvious mistakes? Would it leave subjective interpretation alone? Could they communicate with it through the act of documentation itself? Marcus felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced. Hope, maybe, or purpose. Sarah was right. They were scientists. They documented anomaly. This was just another phenomenon. Even if the phenomenon was studying, they spent the next hour designing a protocol. Marcus would create a new observation log that night, filled with deliberate, inaccurate, wrong measurement, incorrect times, false correlation. But he'd also include genuine observation, mix the error, creating a test to see if the anomaly could distinguish between human mistake and human perception. If it corrected everything, they'd know It had access to objective reality in ways. If it left the genuine observations alone while fixing the error, they'd know it understood intention. Either way, they'd learn something crucial about what they were dealing. Sarah cautioned him to be careful. They were potentially interacting with something that could access his mind that could alter digital and possible cognitive record. Marcus needed to maintain documentation. The anomaly touched. She handed him a small notebook with a lock on it. Old-fashioned paper. He should write his genuine observation before creating the digital test. That way, he'd have an unalterable base to compare it. Marcus took the notebook, feeling the weight of actual paper in his hand, and realized how much he'd come to distrust anything electronic. In a world where data could be refined without permission, analog suddenly felt safer, more real, more true. That night, Marcus sat at his work with a locked notebook beside him and the camera recording everything. He wrote his genuine observations by hand first, each word deliberate and permanent. Then he opened his laptop and began creating the test document, filling it with carefully constructed errors designed to probe the boundaries of the anomaly. As he typed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, reading over his shoulder, waiting patiently for him to sleep, so it could teach him the difference between what he thought he observed and what had actually. The question was whether that difference would save him or destroy everything he thought about the nature of conscious observation and truth. Marcus woke to sunlight he didn't remember seeing in weeks. Not the artificial glow of the archive's fiber optic, but actual morning light filtering his apartment. His head rested on his desk, neck stiff from the awkward angle. The camera was still. His locked notebook sat exactly, and his laptop screen displayed the test document, now transformed into something he could barely recognize as his own. Every deliberate error had been corrected, every false measurement adjusted to match. But the genuine observation, the ones he'd written in the notebook first, remained untouched in the digital. The anomaly had distinguished between mistake and perception. It knew more unsettling. It had added something. At the bottom of the document, in a section Marcus definitely hadn't, was a single paragraph of text that made his hands tremble. The paragraph explained in precise technique that human observation was limited by cognitive bias, perceptual, and the fundamental constraints of conscious experience, time, linear. The anomaly, it stated, existed outside. It could observe events from multiple temporal simultaneous, perceiving cause and effect, not as sequence, but as pattern. The corrections it made to Marcus's documentation weren't intrusion, they were translation. It was helping him see what had actually occurred, stripped of the filtering mechanisms his brain used to construct narrative coherence and chaos. The final sentence stopped his breath entirely. If you consent to full observation, you will understand. Sleep is not required. Only willingness to perceive without the comfort of human. Marcus stared at the word for an hour. Then, too, Sarah arrived mid-morning, saw his face, and knew immediately something had changed. He showed her the document without speaking. She read it twice, then looked at him with an expression he couldn't fear, wonder, recognize. She told him she'd been thinking about her own experience, how the corrected files had always been more accurate, how the enhanced observations had led to breakthroughs in understanding that her limited perception never could have been. What if the anomaly wasn't hostile? What if it was offering something humanity had never? The ability to document reality as it actually, not as human conscious. Marcus opened his locked notebook and compared his handwritten observations to the corrected digital. Every alteration made his notes more accurate, more. The anomaly was right about his limit. But accepting that truth meant accepting that his conscious, his perception, his entire experience of being human was fundamental. It meant surrendering the illusion of objective observation he'd built his career. It meant admitting that something non-human understood reality better. Marcus looked at Sarah and asked if she thought they should tell Holloway. She shook her head slowly. They both knew what would happen. Psychological evaluation removed from act. Everything they'd discovered, classified and buried, unless they could prove it. Unless they could demonstrate that submitting to the Anomaly's correction produced genuinely superior documentation. Sarah suggested something that made Marcus's pulse quicken. What if they both consented? What if they let the Anomaly observe them, refine them, translate their limited human perception into something approaching? They could document the process, create a record of what it meant to be corrected by something beyond human cognition. It would be the most important research in the archive, or it would be the end of everything that made for themselves.